Art history has always been a thing for me and my wife, Jenny. When we were in college, we both took a couple of art history courses that were wildly entertaining. And so, as we fell in love with Italian Renaissance art, we fell in love with each other. And so, ever since then, it's just been part of our lives. So, when we go to a place like the Uffizi in Florence, which if you've never been, we don't just see like a collection of pretty old pictures. Like each piece like tells a story. It speaks of an era. It tells of an idea, of a movement, of an artist. And each piece like begs you to interact, to engage, to participate in it. And Jenny and I, we like to oblige. So I don't just see like some ancient sculpture of Plato. I have a conversation with Plato. And we don't just see a picture of Martin and Margarita Luther. We get a portrait with them. And we don't just imagine, like who are these Duke and Duchess of Urbino? We actually take our portrait with them. And when I see a chiseled Greek god, I think of myself. Yeah. Or when I see Madonna has guns, I think of my wife. My favorite of all time has to be when my wife takes Michelangelo's David, the David, and makes it something appropriate to share on Easter Sunday. Yeah. Okay, enough of that. The artist that demands my attention and captures my imagination more than all, though, like the one I just can't get over is Caravaggio. And in fact, this is how I feel about Caravaggio. Yeah. So in Caravaggio's case, the man is as fascinating as his art. He was known for having a drinking problem, an anger problem, and an addiction that I can't label on an Easter Sunday with kids in the room. He's best known from his criminal record more than his paintings and his journals. His art, like his life, is almost entirely dark, but in every single picture, there is some mysterious light. There's some grace. There is some hope breaking through. And scholars down through the ages now have noted that Caravaggio seems to be able to capture what no other artist could capture because he lived what no other artist lived. So this is the calling of Matthew. This is the moment when Matthew, the tax collector, the man who was absolutely hated because he was supporting the Roman oppressors, of betraying his own people. Everyone hated Matthew, and yet this is the moment when someone comes to him and tells him, he's asking for you. Jesus is calling you, Matthew, to be one of his disciples. And he's like, me? You. Here's the moment just before Jesus is arrested. Judas, like one of the closest friends of Jesus, betrays him with a kiss. The simple work. So Caravaggio had been out drinking all night again and got into a bar fight again, except this time he accidentally kills the man. So he stumbles home that night, and reeling from shame, reeking of alcohol, he paints this. It's the image of the boy David who just killed Goliath and holds his head in his hand, and he paints his own face on Goliath's head. And that brings us to this masterpiece, the incredulity of Thomas. So this is the story of Thomas. Like the news is spread, we have seen the risen Lord, but what does Thomas say? I will not believe. Unless I can put my finger in his side, unless I can see it for myself, unless I can touch it, I will not believe. So Jesus shows up, takes his hand, and thrusts it into his own side. So at the time, there were dozens of technically more gifted, more respected, for sure, artists who had painted this very scene. Let me show you something. Here's one. Here's another one. This one's maybe the closest we have to something like Caravaggio. And yet, 400 years later, Caravaggio's work is the only one that the world simply cannot forget. You see, everyone else, they do a good job painting a Bible story, a story about Thomas, but Caravaggio, he does something more personal, something like sears itself into your memory the way like a moment of shame or an unexpected kindness burns itself into your memory. So why can we not forget Caravaggio? Because he's not just painting a story about Thomas. He's painting his own story. He's painting his own doubt. Caravaggio knew Thomas because Caravaggio was Thomas. And today we're going to look at this story, the story of doubting Thomas. And I want to invite you to read the story like that. Not just as some like historical event that took place long ago, although it is a historical event. And not just as some moral lesson, although I hope it's not immoral. But I want to encourage you to read it like Caravaggio, to find yourself in it, identify with it, enter into it, see if you can see yourself in it, and see if you can see some beam of light breaking through the darkness of doubt. So here's the thing. I know your secret. I've been a pastor for 18 years now. And others might not know. But I know. You are Thomas. Now, maybe not all of you. Maybe not all of you. Let me qualify this. But according to the research of UPenn neurotheologian Andrew Newberg, 90% of those who are deeply religious struggle with significant doubt. That's what his findings show, and that's what my experience agrees with. That in this room, at least 90% of us have struggled with significant doubts. And here's the thing, if you don't consider yourself deeply religious, that means you're even more likely to struggle with significant doubts. According to Newberg, 99% of those who are professing atheists say they struggle with significant doubts that maybe I got it wrong. Maybe there is a God. Maybe the Bible is true. Maybe Jesus did rise from the dead. So, yeah, the great part about living in the post-Christian, post-truth, postmodern world is that you get to construct your own reality. You get to speak your own truth. It's amazing, the freedom that you can be like God and construct your own reality. It's fantastic. The only downside was that nobody actually believes in your reality or your truth, not even you. So believers and unbelievers alike, we all struggle with doubt. We live in an age of unrelenting doubt. We're all Thomas now. So if you're sitting here this Easter morning wondering, like, what am I doing here? They're talking about Christ being risen. I don't even know what I believe. You, my friend, are in good company. So this morning, we're going to look at an Easter story about doubt. John chapter 20, verses 24 through 31. This is the story most popularly known as Doubting Thomas. Now, when we come to John chapter 20, let me just set this up. This is not our first go-round with Thomas. Like, he's a fixture of the Gospels. We know Thomas. So he's been there from the beginning. So the Sermon on the Mount, he was there. Jesus walking on the water, he was there. The feeding of the 5,000, he was there. The blind receiving sight, the lame walking, Lazarus rising from the grave, he was there. But then they show up in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, and on Thursday, he's arrested and tortured. On Friday, they nail him to a cross like some kind of criminal. On Saturday, he's buried in a tomb, and then Sunday. Some women, they go to the tomb, and it's empty. It's empty. So they run back and they tell John and Peter, they run to the tomb to see what's going on there, and we read in John chapter 20 that John, he saw and believed. And then Mary Magdalene, one of the women who went to the tomb and found it empty, she doesn't know what to do with this because she believes someone's stolen his body. And so she's just standing there outside of the tomb, weeping and weeping. And then this gardener comes up to her and says, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And as soon as he says her name, Mary, she knows who it is. It's Jesus. So she runs back and tells the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." So he saw and believed. Now she sees and believes. And then later that night, they're in a locked room, and Jesus appears, and they say, we have seen the Lord. So do you hear the pattern here? He sees and believes. She sees and believes. They see and believe. And so don't you start to wonder here? Well, that's great for them. But what about me? Like, what about those of us who never get to see the resurrected Jesus in the flesh? How are we supposed to believe? So then John adds one more story. John chapter 20, starting in verse 24. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. We don't know why, but for whatever reason, he wasn't there when Jesus showed up. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. So we know where this is headed. So let's set this up. Let's remember who Thomas is. He is not an outsider. He is one of the 12. He's an insider. In fact, he's so much of an insider that he has a nickname. Do you see that? Also called Didymus. That literally means the twin. The twin. Jesus gave him a nickname. So back in my 1990s high school wrestling glory days, our coach would sometimes bequeath on one of the members of our team a nickname. I, of course, was Pretty Boy. Yeah, I know. I would let Coach call me that, but anyone else who did, I tried to rip their arms off. Yeah. So I can't share the other nicknames from the pulpit. Yeah, because they're mostly like anatomical and wildly inappropriate. Yeah. But in some weird way, when the coach would give you this horrific, foul name, you knew that the coach loved you. It was weird, I know. But if you were one of the lucky few wrestlers that got a nickname from the coach, you would do anything for him. If he told you to rip off your right arm and hand it to him, you would have. I would have. Because you knew he loved you. And somehow that same, or at least in a more sanctified way, somehow that same thing seems to be at play among Jesus' disciples. So Jesus gives some of his disciples nicknames. Those he's really close to. Peter, the rock. James and John, the sons of thunder. And Thomas, he's one of the few. He gets a nickname, the twin. So scholars, they speculate over why does Jesus give him this name. Some suggest that he looked and acted just like Jesus. He's my twin. Well, we can't be sure, but if that's what it means, wow. What we can be sure of is that Jesus never called Thomas doubting Thomas. Never. Like, we tend to identify Thomas by his doubt as though his doubt defines him, but not Jesus. Jesus sees, he might struggle with doubt, but that's not who he is. He's my twin. So what we do know of Thomas is that he was radically committed to Jesus. He was one of the 12. In order to be one of the 12, you had to be willing to give up everything, to walk away from your family, your career, your possessions, your dreams, your future, your security, just to be with Jesus. You had to be willing to walk away from everything, and Thomas did that, and when it gets tested, he doesn't hesitate. So John chapter 11, Jesus says, hey guys, we're going back to Judea. And they're like, Jesus, that's a great idea, except don't you remember last time we were there, someone tried to kill us? Yeah. But Jesus is like, no, we're headed to Judea. And Thomas then says, then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Like, I have no idea why Jesus is doing this. I know that we will probably die if we go there. But it is better to die with Jesus than live without Jesus. That's Thomas. So when we come to this Easter story, don't be confused here. Thomas is not like some half-hearted follower who never really knew Jesus. He sacrificed everything. He loves Jesus with all of his heart, mind, soul, and strength, and that's what makes it so devastating. He put his life into Jesus' hands, and then Jesus' hands were nailed to a cross. Can you imagine the loss he's felt in the last few days? Can you imagine how confused and angry and stupid and wounded he must be feeling right now? He bet his whole life on Jesus, and like that, it's taken away from him. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Unless. So I wonder, where do you think this kind of doubt comes from? Do you think that the real problem is that Thomas just needs more evidence? Do you think the problem is we need more evidence? So I'm not saying that Jesus rising from the dead is like normal or expected. In my experience, people don't rise from the dead. I mean, of course, you have some exceptions. You have Lazarus, right? He rises from the dead, but Lazarus is not still alive. He died a long, long time ago. Jesus, on the other hand, is claiming something totally different. He claims to be resurrected with a new, imperishable, immortal body. And that is something new. It's literally part of a new creation. He's saying that he is no longer bound by the same laws of chaos and corruption and death that give me wrinkles and make me wear reading glasses and make it really terrible if I eat jalapenos after 8 p.m. So it's understandably hard to believe, but what if 10, 11, 12 of your closest friends you've done life with for the last 3 years, 24/7, what if they came to you and said, I swear to you, we saw him? What if you followed him all those years and you heard him teach, I am the resurrection and the life? What if you personally saw him speak to a dead man, come out, and Lazarus came out of his tomb? What if he had repeatedly told you, listen, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be betrayed, mocked, beaten, crucified, but then 3 days later I'm going to rise from the dead? So I'm not saying that Jesus' resurrection is obvious or reasonable. We're way beyond that. This is what theologians call mystery. It does not fit into our categories. Dead people don't come back to life with imperishable bodies. It's just not a thing that math or science or philosophy can prove. But what do you do with the evidence? I mean, Jesus claimed to be God. He demonstrated his power over creation and death. He repeatedly predicted that he would die and rise again. And then Thomas's closest friends come to him and say, we've seen the resurrected Lord. And then they're going to go on to suffer and die for that message. Whatever, they clearly believe it to the core of their being because they're willing to die for it. So Thomas, what about you? What do you conclude? And he says, I will not believe unless. Thomas will only believe if Jesus meets his conditions. Tempting, isn't it? Have you ever done this? I will not believe unless you can tell me how a good God allows so much evil. I will not believe unless you can tell me why God let my friend get cancer. I will not believe unless you can tell me how the dinosaurs fit into Genesis. I will not believe unless you can tell me why God seems to be so obsessed with who I sleep with. These are good questions. Questions we shouldn't be afraid of. Questions we should ask. Questions that are most welcome in this space. But I wonder if God were to take the time and answer every single one of your questions, would that be enough? I mean, do you think that the main reason for your doubt is that you don't have enough information or the right answers? Because James, the brother of Jesus, he points out that demons actually have all the right information and the right answers. He says, you believe that there's one God? Good! Even the demons believe that and shudder. It's entirely possible to have all the right answers and not trust God. It's entirely possible to know the right answers and refuse to accept it. In fact, I want you to notice Thomas's wording here. He does not say, I cannot believe. He says, I will not believe. Now, parents, if you ask your kids, hey, will you do the dishes? And they say, I cannot do the dishes. You'd be like, oh, what's going on? Can I help you with something? What's getting in the way of that? But if they turn to you and say, I will not do the dishes, that's a different conversation, isn't it? Yeah? Thomas just said, I will not believe. So cannot suggest a lack of capacity, as though it were out of his hands or external, I can't do anything about it. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying, I will not. This is an act of the will. It's internal. He chooses not to believe. I will not believe. Which begs the question, what's going on in his soul right now? What is stopping him from believing this good news? Like you would think, if there's something that he wants to hear, it's that Jesus is alive, but something in him is holding him back. So a few years ago, I had the privilege of going to a summer course at Cambridge. And one of the lectures was with Dr. Joanna Collicutt, and she was there for the whole time. And I learned so much from her. She's like a professor, psychologist, Anglican priest. And she gave one lecture in particular that kind of just shook me. It was on how moments of crisis, things that we might call trauma, intense grief, stress, difficulty, how when they come into our lives, they reshape our basic assumptions. They challenge our basic assumptions about life, and then they form us into something new spiritually and psychologically. So we all hold these basic assumptions about life, basic assumptions about who God is, how life is supposed to be, how things work. So for visual purposes, imagine these are the containers about your assumptions, like life is good. My family, I can always count on my family. I'll outlive my kids. This is who I am. Like these basic, so think of different types of assumptions you may or may not have. The world's basically a safe place. My life has meaning. My family will be there for me. I can trust my friends. My kids will outlive me. On and on we could go. Now, these might not be your assumptions. I don't know what your assumptions are. But we all have these types of assumptions, and they then form like a lens or filter or matrix through which we see everything else, through which we see ourselves and God and the world. And we might not even know what they are. That's the thing. It's just the air we breathe. We assume them. We don't even think about them. We don't reason through them. We assume them. But then she asked the question, so what happens when your house burns to the ground, literally or metaphorically? What happens when you get cancer? What happens when your parents get divorced? What happens when you get divorced or your dreams die? Or you have to bury your own child? What happens when you do something you cannot undo? You see, she says it doesn't just upset you. It's not just like another thing. What happens is when something that severe takes place in your life, then suddenly one of your most precious assumptions in life gets taken, and it's not just bent, it's not just changed, it's not just challenged. It actually gets, in her words, shattered. And you can never put it back together again. It shakes you to your core. You no longer know if you believe any of this. You no longer know who you are. You no longer know why you exist. You no longer know what the meaning of life is. You no longer know if you can trust anyone, not even God. And Collicutt points out that sometimes in these moments of crises, they lead you into a deeper experience of God, into a peace that passes understanding, into a sense of his presence that you could never know if you didn't go through the crisis. If you weren't first smashed, you would never know his grace in your life like that. But then other times, you get lost in the broken pieces. God feels absent. Life feels meaningless. You're no longer sure of anything. You pull into yourself. And you just want to numb, you just want to hide, you just want to stop the pain. And her point is either way, when you run into those crisis moments in life, they transform you. They transform your relationships, they change your life, they change the way you view everything. You will never be the same person on the other side of it. You can't go back. So I wonder if that isn't what's happening in Thomas's soul here. I wonder if this doesn't give us a way of framing our own doubts, because it certainly speaks to mine. So what has led to significant doubts in my life? Well, when I was a teenager, it was moral crisis. I had a few people in my life who were heroes. Heroes of the faith. People who I thought that's what it means to be a Christ follower. And then they failed tragically. In my 20s, it was intellectual crisis. Because I went off to seminary and I learned some things. I discovered that things I'd been taught my whole life about God and the Bible just weren't true. or were half-truths. Some things were just dumb. Just dumb. And I started asking, can I believe any of this? In my 30s, it was relational crisis. Because I just thought I could trust everyone. And I would open up my life and share it with everyone. I just want to share my life with you. And then some people that I deeply loved betrayed me. And it shattered my view of other people, my view of the church. My 40s was the worst. It was identity crisis. I learned things about myself that I didn't want to know. And so my view of myself had to get smashed. Now maybe it's different for you. Maybe if you just had a really good answer about the dinosaurs, you'd believe everything else. Huh? Huh. But at least for me, I find that my doubts are born out of crisis. They're born out of pain. They're born out of times when I've trusted someone or something and then found it to be false, found it to be broken. And just the risk of putting myself out there again, it feels too much. So Collicott, she suggests that this shattering and then rebuilding, this deconstructing and reconstructing of our belief system, this is normal. As terrible as it is, it's normal. And thanks be to God, God somehow uses this messy, terrible process to refine us, to make us who we're truly created to be, to straighten what's bent in our souls. So then each shattering becomes an opportunity. It can be an opportunity to open up your life to God's grace and become more who you're called to be, more like Jesus Christ, or to pull into yourself and become less. Both are real possibilities. So Thomas here, I think this makes some sense of his story. He just lost everything. He believed that Jesus was the Messiah and risked everything, gave up his whole life to follow him, and then shattered. Now he has a choice. Do I open up again? Do I take the risk to believe? I've been down that road. Do I open up again? A week later, his disciples were in the house again. Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." You see, Jesus so loves Thomas that he shows up just for him. He disrobes and he meets Thomas's ridiculous conditions. Put your finger here. And then he commands him, stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus said to him, "Because you've seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So this is the part of the story where Jesus is talking to Thomas and then he turns to us. He's talking to you. He's talking to all of us who hear this story. In fact, John's going to then add to this. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That John says, I just wrote this gospel, I just wrote this book, I just wrote this story, the whole book, but this story in particular, so that you may come to trust Jesus, to believe that the God of the universe actually loves you that much, that he actually came after you, that the God of the universe actually calls you and is inviting you into relationship, that you would finally just let down your guard and accept this amazing news. But what do you do when something in your soul says, I will not believe? So John gives them some specific advice here. John seems to think that the first thing you should do is read his book. Read the Gospel of John. That's what he's telling us to do there. Not because it will necessarily answer all of your questions. It's not even trying to do that. but because it will introduce you to Jesus. And the more you know Jesus, the more you'll come to trust Jesus. The more you know Jesus, the more you'll come to trust him. Not because you can understand him, but because you know he's good. Like all relationships, trust takes time, and reading John is just a start. The other thing I would add to this, though, is you shouldn't do this on your own. You were never meant to do this on your own. You were never meant to just figure this out in your mind and heart by yourself. So if you're asking questions like, who is Jesus, and why did he die on the cross, and why do Christians believe that he rose from the dead with a new imperishable body, and can I actually trust the Bible? Those are great questions. In fact, I love those questions. I wish people would ask me more of those types of questions. I so look forward to those questions. In fact, we exist to create space so that you can explore those questions and we can walk with you in that. We have some upcoming courses, one called Alpha, one called What Christians Ought to Believe. Chris will give you more details at the end. But I just want to encourage you, if you're asking those questions, don't try to do it on your own. But this story, Thomas's story, makes us painfully aware that for most of us, most of our doubts tend to run much, much deeper than intellectual questions. So what do you do when your assumptions have been shattered? When you don't know who you are or who you can trust? When you're not sure if you can trust anyone, not even God? What do you do when you are deeply wounded or disillusioned or disappointed? Can I just say, if you find yourself there today, I've been there, and I am so sorry. I am so sorry that you're there right now. Maybe Jesus' words to Thomas are for you as well. Jesus says to Thomas, stop doubting and believe, which is true. That's what it says in English. But I'm not quite sure this is the right tone. It feels a little harsh to me. I don't know about you. In Greek, John loves the word believe. We see, if you read through the Gospel of John, you'll see the word believe everywhere. It's pisteuo in Greek. And in fact, the passage we just read through, there's like 8 verses, he uses pisteuo 5 times. Believe, 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 believe. Like, so you go through the Gospel of John and he will say believe over and over, something like 60 times. It's just everything, believe, believe, believe. It's on repeat all the way throughout the Gospel of John. But here's the thing. Jesus doesn't actually tell Thomas to believe. He doesn't tell him to pisteuo. He tells him to pistos. It's curious. In fact, this is the only time this word occurs in the Gospel of John. And this is the only time in the entire New Testament that this word is actually translated believe. Curious, right? It's usually translated like faithful or trustworthy, like you might know the parable of the faithful servant, the faithful steward, and the unfaithful servant. Faithful, unfaithful. This is the same idea. So this is literally, stop doubting is do not be apistos, but be pistos. Don't be not pistos, but be pistos. Don't be unfaithful, but be faithful. In fact, some scholars suggest that's how we should translate it. Stop being unfaithful and be faithful. And I want you to hear the difference here. Jesus is not telling Thomas to change how he feels in his heart of hearts. He's commanding him, be faithful to me. Like, I know you're hurting right now, but don't give up on me. Don't walk away from me. I'm not giving up on you. Don't give up on me. This is not a call to believe, to affirm the doctrine of resurrection. This is a call to be faithful to me. It's relational. So, and I wonder if this isn't part of the answer to how we deal with our own doubts. So when doubts come, Jesus doesn't tell us to sit around and wait for the perfect answer, and he doesn't tell us to wait until it feels true in our heart of hearts, and he doesn't command us to study more. He commands us, be faithful to me. Don't give up on me. Don't walk away from me. So when you don't know what you believe anymore, pray. And when you don't know who you are or who God is, read your Bible. And when nothing makes sense to you and all your assumptions feel smashed, shattered, go to church. Worship. When you feel lost, Do not give up on Jesus. Don't walk away. Don't stop talking to him. Don't ignore him. You just be faithful to trust him and trust him to take care of you. So, Paul, are you saying you want me to fake it? I'm like, oh, heavens, no, friends. In fact, next week we're going to start a sermon series on how to pray the Psalms. Those brutally honest Psalms like, God, I'm not sure I believe in you anymore. God, I'm really disappointed in you. God, I hate those people and I want you to kill them. Yeah, have you prayed that one recently? Yes, it's in there. It's in there. So no one's asking you to fake anything. Jesus is simply asking you to not give up on him. He knows things are hard. And he's in it with you. But if you would just bring your life, all the broken pieces to him and place them in his nail-pierced hands, he doesn't promise that your life is going to be easy. But he does promise he will never leave you or forsake you. He does promise that it'll be good. And he does promise that in the end, he will make you unbreakable like him. Let's pray. Father, just give you ourselves, our doubts, our fears, our wounds. And God, in a room like this, I know so many of us have just been shattered. And so God, I pray especially for those right now who their families have been shattered, their lives have been shattered, their dreams have been shattered, the things that they thought they knew, they no longer know. Lord, I pray that they would hear your voice calling them to be faithful to you. God, I pray that you meet them in that, and I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.